Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to class 3, lesson 3 of the journey of the soul. Sydney was on his deathbed, and he was laying in bed. His oldest son, Morris, his firstborn, pride and joy, is standing by his father's bedside, and it's very serious and tense. And his father, laying there, gasping his last breath, smells the delicious smell of apple pie coming from the kitchen. It's his wife, Barbara's classic apple pie. And Morris loved him some apple pie. So he says to his son, what was his name? Sydney. Morris, who is who? I don't remember who is who. Forgive me. I get those details wrong. He says to his son, please go to the kitchen, ask your mother to give me a slice of pie. I'd love to pass from this world into the next with the taste of your mother's delicious apple pie on my palate. And so his son runs off to the kitchen and says, Mom, a slice of apple pie for Dad, his last wish. And his mom said, absolutely not. Tell him he can't have any. It's for the shiva. So that's a perfect segue into tonight's class, because tonight we're going to talk about the people that are left behind. We're going to talk about mourning. We're going to talk about grief. And while the last two lessons we were focused on the person who's passing away and who's passed, tonight we're going to focus on the people that remain back here. And what that little joke tells us right off the bat, you got it. Awesome. Thank God. What that little joke tells us is that there's no one way. There's no one way to grieve. There's no correct way. People deal with death and people deal with grief in all kinds of different ways. And that's going to be a theme that will reappear throughout tonight's lesson. So let's keep that in mind. Also, as is the case with this topic in general, and we mentioned this in past classes as well, what we're going to be talking about obviously will touch people in different ways, and people will relate to it in different ways. Some of these things are more immediate to some people and personal to people. We're kind of taking a general approach to this, an impersonal one, if you will. And so if it's something that strikes a chord or something that we want to talk about, if we can have a constructive conversation, informative one, then please, by all means, let's talk about it tonight. But anything else beyond it, we'll leave for maybe for some private time. We can always do that later. So let's jump into tonight's topic. Tonight's topic is mourning and grieving, shiva, and what all of that is about. So I think it's self-evident that no two people grieve the same way, and there's no one way or even a correct way to grieve. There are people who are so overwhelmed that they become paralyzed by their grief. They look like they're not present in this world. They can't get their life together. They walk around like zombies and are completely crushed, devastated, and are a shell of what they once were before they were visited by loss. Other people seem to get up, wipe their hands, and just move on as if nothing ever happened. So there are all different types of ways. Even within one unit, within one community, within one family, you'll see people that will experience loss in different ways. Now, there are many different reasons for this, many different factors. Obviously, no loss is exactly the same, and no two relationships are exactly the same. Everybody's different. We have different personalities. But the point is that people grieve in different ways. And so tonight we're going to take a look at this and see what we can offer, some general guidelines and principles and obviously Jewish values as they pertain to this process and how they can help us move along. But before we do that, we have to ask really a basic fundamental question, okay? Since I told you what tonight's class is about, you probably already can guess the answer, right? But is grieving good? Is grieving appropriate? Is it something one should do? We're going to quote from Socrates. You may have heard of him. I'm going to quote something that I found on Google, and then we're going to read a text here from Socrates. About Socrates' death from Plato, one of his great students, who you may have heard of as well. So he says like this: "To fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows what one does not know. No one knows whether death may not be the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils." So that's one quote. It's slightly off our topic, to be fair, but still it gives us a little bit of insight into Socrates' position on death. Socrates' position, as will become apparent from Phaedo, which is Plato's work describing the events surrounding Socrates' death. We're going to see that Socrates didn't believe in mourning at all, right? So let's take a look at text 3, and it's on page 87 in your textbook. So let's see like this, okay? So Socrates instructed. Again, this is Plato writing. Plato wasn't actually at Socrates. That Socrates died because, well, he had annoyed Athens. He annoyed his government, possibly because he was very into the Socratic method, which annoyed people at dinner parties, I imagine. That might be the reason. Okay, that was a bad joke, never mind. And but he was eventually tried to put and sentenced to death, and he was poisoned. And he was, when he was imprisoned, before he was sent to death, his students had actually bribed the guards and actually even had the opportunity to have him escape. He was able to escape, but he refused. According to some opinions, he refused to go. It's speculated by the scholars as to why exactly he chose not to go. Maybe because he felt that he'd eventually be caught, maybe because he felt it would endanger his students that helped him. But one reason that's useful for our conversation tonight is because Socrates, as we were about to read, didn't believe that one should be afraid of death, and so, or even grieve death. And so therefore, for him to escape death would seem to run in the face of his philosophies and teachings that he had espoused. So let's see what he says here, okay? So Socrates says to Cebus, "Please relate the following message to Venus and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me," meaning that he should come after me to the afterlife, to the other world, next world, "if he be a wise man, and not tarry, and that today I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must." Simmias said, "What a message for such a man. Having been a frequent companion of his," meaning of Venus, "I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged." Right? He wouldn't willingly commit suicide. "Why," said Socrates, "is not Venus a philosopher?" "I think that he is," said Simmias. "Then he, or any man who has the spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another." Okay, so Socrates is basically saying, yeah, don't kill yourself, but there's nothing wrong with death and dying, and the philosopher should be willing to die. Okay, so that's his position. What's the Jewish position? So let's take a look at text 4 from Maimonides. We've been quoting him a lot in his Laws of Mourning. He says, "We are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin." Right? There's a biblical command. One of the mitzvahs of the Torah is to mourn our next of kin. So there's an obligation to mourn and to grieve. Why does Judaism not only allow it, but actually say that one should grieve? Right? What's the reason for it? So let's dig a little deeper here. Okay, let's look at text 5a from Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. In Hebrew, their names are even closer together, Rambam and Ramban. So he says like this. Nachmanides says, in his commentary on the Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they are alive. Right? So in other words, when your child goes off to college for the first time, or a kid goes off to summer camp, you're sad and you get emotional and you cry. Why? Because they're separating from you, they're going away from you, makes you sad. How much more so when somebody passes away, they're separating from you physically, and that is sad for us. So according to Nachmanides, what's going on here? According to Nachmanides, it's human nature to be sad when we separate from another. And so therefore, it's appropriate to mourn because it's an expression of that sadness, of that reality. So that's one insight into the reason for mourning. You know, the president of the shul was once walking his dog, and he hears somebody shouting and screaming, and the voice sounds vaguely familiar to him. So he starts heading towards it, and he sees, to his horror, the rabbi of his synagogue is standing out on his front porch, and he's yelling and just going out of his mind, shouting at a group of kids that had been playing in the newly, freshly laid sidewalk in front of his house. And he's screaming at them and just completely lost it. So the president is horrified. He turns to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I don't understand. Every week from the pulpit, you talk about patience, and you talk about how we have to love children and how they're our future, and how we have to embrace them and celebrate them and be compassionate to them and kind to them. Look at you. Well, look what's going on." So the rabbi said, "I like children in theory, but not in the concrete." Yeah, there's a concrete sidewalk. You got it? Okay, good. Very good. Okay. I think for Zoom, when everybody's muted, we need to install a laugh track, and I can just hit a button and just entertain myself that way. Anyway, so in other words, what is Nachmanides saying here? Okay, is he saying that really, in theory, we shouldn't be sad, but since, in the concrete we are, so the Torah sort of allows us a way to express what we naturally feel, but in theory it might not be appropriate. Well, that could be based on Maimonides, but let's take a look at text 5b from Maimonides, not from his code of law, but from his Guide to the Perplexed, more as philosophical work, moral work. So Maimonides says, mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of lighthearted activities. So here, Maimonides is telling us, he's taking it really a step further than Nachmanides. Nachmanides is saying that it's human nature to grieve, and so therefore the Torah tells us we should grieve. Okay, but is that nature, is that good or bad? Not clear from Nachmanides. Maimonides is saying that actually grieving is helpful to a human being because what's he say? It brings comfort, right? Mourners find comfort in their sorrow, right? And so therefore we want to comfort mourners. We want them to find comfort. So the way to end consolation, part of that is to allow the space for crying and for grieving. But let's find an even stronger statement about grief according to the Jewish perspective. And this is from the Radvaz. We quoted him actually in lesson 1, but let's quote again from him. He says like this, text 5c. I hope you're all with me. Question. Yeah, this is the Radvaz. Rabbi Zevin Zimmer was a rabbi. People turned to him with all kinds of questions. So this is a question that was posed to him and his answer. So he says like this. The question is, one of this generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? This is a question somebody asked the Radvaz in the 1500s. So the Radvaz answers like this. He says, such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose. By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for restrictions on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts, etc. We're going to return to these laws later. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise. Okay, so this is Radbaz. He explains this in no uncertain terms that weeping and grieving and sadness is the appropriate way. And in fact, the opposite is the way of the philosophers. He was probably referencing Socrates and his ilk, and saying that such behavior is heartless, distasteful, cruel. He uses very strong terminology to describe somebody who doesn't grieve, who's not saddened by the loss of life. So what is he saying? That this idea of mourning, of grieving, represents a Jewish truth. What truth does it represent? Well, from the last two lessons, we gain some insight into that, right? We talked about the fact that this is the world for which everything was created. This is the world where purpose happens. This is the world where we partner with God. This is the most important, the most consequential, and the most significant part of the soul's lifetime, is this space, the soul in this body, in this world. And to not grieve the end of that, right? To not grieve that loss of life would be to well, besides the cruelty that it shows in the personal character, would be, in a sense, to deny the importance of life in this world, right? Which is, by the way, I think really it's a uniquely Jewish perspective, right? That this world is the most important place. In other faiths, you've got this idea that this world is sort of a holding cell. It's just a way to get to your ultimate destination. Judaism says this is the ultimate destination, right here, right now. This is the ultimate destination. Paradise, heaven is very nice and fine. It's got a lot of perks, but it's not the ultimate. This couple was they were really healthy. What should we call her? Susan? I don't know. We have a Susan on the call here tonight, but let's not call her Susan. Sadie was a health nut. And, every day she'd take her husband, they'd go out jogging and walking and hiking, and she'd cook. They're always eating raw vegetables and eating bran and oat bran and oatmeal and all that kind of good stuff. Everything bland and no sugar, no nothing. They were healthy as can be. And in fact, at 85 years old, this couple were fit as can be. They looked like they were not a day older than 60 at 85 years old. And wouldn't you have it? Wouldn't you know it? This fit couple at 85 that could have lived another 100 years, they're out one night and they end up in a tragic, fatal accident, and they both die on the scene. And they come up to heaven. And they come to heaven, and they're escorted to the room. They wake up the next morning, and they see the room they're in is a suite. It's got an ocean view. And they say to the concierge, they call, we're on a budget. They're on Social Security. They don't know if they can afford this. What's the story with this really fancy presidential suite that you gave us with the ocean view? What's the story? So the angel says, this is heaven. This is heaven. It's all free. Okay, great. So they go out and they play a round of golf or bridge or whatever you play in heaven. And it's the most fascinating, the most beautiful grounds. Everything is amazing. And how much for the golf clubs and the golf cart and how many hours go in? The angel says, this is heaven. It's all free. It's heaven. This is paradise. Anyhow, they come back to their residence, and they come to the dining room, and there is this buffet. It makes the best cruises look like amateurs. A buffet with you name it, with ice creams and with omelets and with waffles and with donuts and bagels and spreads and cheese. You name it, it was out there. And they look at the angel and they say, where's the oat bran? Where's the oatmeal? Do you have any whole wheat bread? So the angel says, this is heaven. You could eat as much as you want, of whatever you want, and you don't gain weight and you don't get diabetes. Go to town. So Seymour turns to his wife, Sadie, whatever her name was. I'm having a hard time remembering people's names tonight. And he says, you see, if it wasn't for your darn oat bran, we could have been here 10 years ago. Anyway, how did we get there? I don't remember. Oh, the point is because heaven is wonderful, right? But we know that's not the ultimate. The ultimate is here, this world. We're not in any kind of rush to get to heaven. It's not it's a more pleasant place. You can eat all you want at the eat whatever you can, at the all-you-can-eat buffet. But this is where this is the most important space, and therefore, that separation, when a person's life ends, that is something that's worth crying over and grieving over. Okay, and therefore Judaism actually instructs us, we have a command to grieve, to mourn the loss of the next of kin. So according to the Torah, the rules of mourning, if you look at figure 3.1 in your student books on page 92, who are the people that a person is obligated to mourn? So it's parents, father, mother, sibling, spouse, son, and daughter. Those are the next of kin, those are the close relatives that one is obligated to mourn, and for whom one is to sit shiva. Okay, so these immediate relatives. Okay, now, what is the mourning process? How does this go? So if you look at figure 3.2 on page 93, well, let's take a look at this at these different stages. The time period is aninut. Aninut means the time that or is a time that comes from when the person passes away up until their burial, or sometimes for more practically more relevant would be that some elements of aninut are until the body, till the deceased is handed over to the Chaver Kadisha, to the burial, to the society who will take over the burial. But if one is actively involved in the funeral and those arrangements and the burial, so they have this mourning period. What goes on during that phase, this first stage of mourning? So what happens then? This is the most. Let's read this. Let's read it inside. This is the most intense phase of mourning. At this point, no attempt is even made to comfort or console the mourners. During this period, the next of kin are absolved from all positive mitzvahs, i.e. obligations to do something, such as pray or don tefillin. Nothing should detract or distract from the mourner's pain and their full attention to interment arrangements. Sometime during the aninut stage, the mourners tear their outer garment as a sign of mourning. So that's what happens during aninut. This is the most severe stage of mourning. Then, after the burial, you have shiva. What's shiva? The word shiva is Hebrew. It means 7, because what happens is, after the person is buried, that begins a 7-day mourning period. What happens at the shiva? We're going to see that later, I guess. See below figure 3.5. We'll get to that later. Okay, so because we're going to focus a little bit on the shiva tonight. Then after the shiva, that week, that first week period, which, by the way, we think of shiva, it's called shiva, it's 7 days. In reality, practically speaking, a person doesn't actually follow all the laws associated with shiva, which we'll talk about a little later, for all 7 days, because the first day starts from the moment after burial. So if somebody is buried an hour before sunset, well, that was already day 1 of the shiva. So you've already kind of knocked off 1 day in an hour. And the last day, the 7th day of shiva, also ends in the morning, right after waking up. The first thing in the morning, you wake up, and a few moments later, the person gets up from shiva. They don't go through the whole day. The last day is just the first part of that day, the first early portion of that day. And then generally, depending on there's always a Shabbos in the middle. So during Shabbos, there's no outward display of mourning because it's Shabbos, it's a holy day, it's a happy day. So it ends up being closer to like 5 days. But anyway, that's the shiva, the week-long period. Then you have shloshim. The word shloshim means 30, right? And that's the 30-day period from afterwards that also one still maintains different elements of this of the mourning regulations and restrictions. So let's take a look at here on the chart. A 30-day mourning period commencing with interment. After getting up from the shiva and resuming the everyday routines of life, certain mourning practices are continued until 30 days from the time of burial. These include refraining from wearing new clothes, getting a haircut or shaving, and participating in festive events. Then you have 12 months, which is the 12-month mourning period commencing with interment. After the passing of a parent, some of the shloshim mourning practices, such as not participating in festive events, are continued by the children until 12 months have passed. It is customary for the mourners to keep a candle burning for the entire 12-month period. That is, again, the 12-month period. We mentioned before that the next of kin, when a person is supposed to sit shiva, so aninut, that first stage, up to the burial, shiva, which is the 7-day mourning period, shloshim, the 3rd-day mourning period, that is observed by a person for all of their next of kin. Anybody who one is obligated to mourn and grieve observes all of those stages. But the 12-month mourning period is only for parents. It's only a child mourning a parent and not any other relative. It's just for parents because we know one of the 10 commandments is to honor our parents. So there's a certain heightened level of respect and commitment that we have to accord our parents more than anybody else that we're responsible to. And so therefore that goes on for 12 months. And then finally we have yahrzeit, which is the yahrzeit means the year's time, the anniversary, an anniversary of the passing, when certain elements of mourning are practiced. It's for somebody observing a yahrzeit, it's a sad day in a sense. You don't want to have any kind of festive celebration on that day, although there is a proper way to observe it in a positive light and so on, but still it's a bit of a serious day, and there's Kaddish that's said, and there's extra studying, extra charity, and other good deeds that are done on that day, and also appropriate to have a gathering to reflect on the life of the one whose yahrzeit is being observed. That's something that we do every year thereafter. Okay, so these are the stages of mourning. Now, interesting that there's a there are researchers who are doing research on grief, and one group of researchers were focused on the functionality of the people who suffered a loss. How are they functioning? How are they dealing with everyday life? That was one group of researchers researching specifically that. They didn't pay attention to the type of loss, the circumstance. They just wanted to know, person experienced loss, how are they functioning following that loss? And then there was a second a group of researchers, totally independently of the first, that were focusing, also researching grief, and they were focusing on the relationship between the person who was grieving and the one that they lost. What was their relationship like? What were the dynamics of that relation? Two separate areas of research on grief. There's a professor at the University of Haifa who also was studying grief, and he came across these two tracks of grief and found them to be completely separate tracks that people were looking at independent of the other. And he thought to himself, well, why not combine the two? And for that, they named him Captain Obvious. And now he goes by Captain Obvious. No, he was, this researcher, this professor, wanted to look at the two of them together. Anyway, so he published way back in the early 80s. And then he's written, more recently, in 2014, he wrote about these two tracks, the way a person has limited functionality and its direct relationship with the relationship that person had with the one that they're grieving. Yeah, if you're with me, if you in your student book, you'll be able to follow through this chart. If you'd like, we're going to just gloss over it. But what was interesting was that he found that these benchmarks, according to Jewish law, the ones that we just listed, the aninus, the shiva, the shloshim, and the 12 months, those benchmarks set up by Jewish law, ancient wisdom, so long ago, there's a correlation between them, and it helps people navigate and get through these steps. So you can take a look at that if you like. We're gonna keep moving. Okay. So I mentioned the rabbi who liked children in theory but not the concrete, right? So let's talk about grief somewhat in the concrete. One of the things that is done, that's actually a requirement according to Jewish law, is that when one suffers a loss, and we actually touched on it last week, and we talked about a practice that was discontinued, which was to tear one's garments when they were present at the time of death. If they're standing bedside, when somebody passes away and they're present, to tear their garments, right? That's the Jewish value. We said that was stopped because people didn't have that many pairs of clothing. They didn't want to go around tearing the one good shirt that they had. So people stopped attending. They heard somebody was dying. They turned around, they went the other way. And that was a problem. So that is not in practice. And even family members, close family members, so the tearing of garments happens generally at the funeral. That's typically where it would happen. And what exactly happens? There's a requirement that when one suffers this loss and is mourning one of those, the next of kin that we mentioned earlier, so they tear their garments. Who's the first person we find that tears their garments in grief? Anybody? So close. Oh, you're cheating. You're looking ahead. I can't give you a book. Unbelievable. Yeah, it's Jacob grieving for Joseph. Let's take a look at text 6. Yeah, from Genesis. The brothers slaughtered a goat. For those of you who where in our last course, Secrets of the Bible, you might remember elements of this story of Joseph and his brothers and them selling him into slavery. So here, let's read text 6. The brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the colored tunic home, and the couriers brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days. So Jacob, upon discovering the death of his son, he tears his clothes. Tearing your clothing represents an act of grief, right? That's an act of grief. What is the psychology behind it? Let's look at text 7. Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz states in Halachot that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. Yeah. So this is the Beis Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Ayash is quoting Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, who says that he explains the reason one tears the garments is it sort of distracts the mourner. The mourner is so consumed by their grief, suddenly they tear their shirt, and now they're like, oh, I have to go buy a new shirt. I wonder, I got this one on sale, or I didn't get this one on sale, or whatever. The little distracting, and so therefore a little bit comforting. So says Rabbi Ayash, he says, no, in my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss. To really for there to be like sort of a visceral sort of reaction experience that accompanies this terrible feeling that the person has. So mourning is a process, and grieving is a process that is, in a sense, triggered by the rending of garments, by the tearing. Remember hearing a long time ago, something that always stuck with me about rending garments, about tearing, is that this idea of tearing something, destroying something, is so antithetical to Torah values. The Torah instructs us, Jewish values are not to be wasteful, not to destroy things, right? You're not supposed to destroy. And here, taking a perfectly good shirt or blouse or jacket, and we're destroying it. And in fact, when one tears their garments, certainly for their parents, they're never allowed to sew it again. That remains, it's permanent. You can't sew it back up. So that's it, you destroyed something. Now, from the text that we just read, from text 7, we can understand this destruction is not just for the sake of destruction. It has a certain therapeutic component to it, right? So to destroy something that allows a person to grieve or to move into a different space is actually not destructive at all. It's actually constructive, right? On the one hand, but really, it comes out in this idea of tearing, of destroying, because in a sense, it expresses this idea that death destroys and shatters our whole notion of life and of self. And of everything that we value. Judaism is a religion is a faith of life. The Torah is a Torah of life. God is a living God. The soul is a living being. And to encounter death, to come face to face with death, it shatters us. And so the only correct response is to express that shattering in the form of breaking, of tearing that garment. Something that it's almost like breaking our own values. It's a total devastation. There's this common practice today that was, according to Rabbi Maurice Lamb, who wrote a book on mourning and grieving. According to him, it was enterprising undertakers that came up with this idea that they give mourners at the cemetery a piece of torn black ribbon, and they pin it to the person's shirt, and people walk around with this black ribbon. It's so superficial, it's so shallow, and so misses the really the point, the beauty and the horror and the trauma of tearing the garments. Of death and loss is not a superficial thing. It's not a symbolic thing. We don't symbolically mourn. It's something that cuts to our core. It's something that shatters our world, that shatters our reality to the point that we do something that normally we wouldn't do, to just destroy something. And we wear that as a badge of grief, of mourning, of destruction, for a whole week. Okay. That's the a little bit of the meaning of the tearing of the garments, the kriya. But mourning is not something. Mourning is not something that we do forever. Or, well, the truth is, it's something that exists forever, and we do, I guess, forever in a certain sense. But it's something that is a process that we need to go through, a process that we need to evolve through. Okay, let's take a look at text 8. Neither cry for the dead nor bemoan him. That's the verse in Jeremiah. So the Talmud says like this: neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. How are we expected to act, asks the Talmud? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, and 30 days for restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. Once these have elapsed, God declares, you are not more compassionate than I. Right? So to grieve sort of indefinitely or forever is to suggest that you are more, that one is more disappointed or more devastated by death than even God himself. We know that God grieves and mourns the loss of his creation, the loss of life. And so if God prescribes a certain set amount of time for this grieving process to continue to grieve, and again, as I mentioned, loss is always there, and there's a sadness and there's a mourning that exists forever. We're not suggesting that it ceases completely. It's not a switch that you turn off. But the point is that it's a process that we have to go through and work our way up that ladder, down that road, right? Take those steps to be able to move on in life, right? And so the process of moving on begins with shiva, okay? With this 7-day process. And within that 7-day process, you've got the first 3 days for weeping. That's intense mourning. And then you've got the other 4 for eulogizing, for talking and reflecting on the person's life. You see there's a transition. The first 3 days, you're inconsolable. And then afterwards, we need to start opening the door to the reflecting on the positives of the person's life, reflecting on their achievements, reflecting on what the type of lives they lived, which allows the mourner to transition from that completely inconsolable grief to a celebration of the person's life. Okay, that begins that process. And so it starts with the shiva process. Right, aninot, that first stage, which is up until interment, there's no consoling, there's no comforting, there's none of that. The person's not even ready for that yet. It's too raw, it's too open, and it's still ongoing. At that moment, that would be completely insensitive. It would be cruel to try and comfort somebody, distract somebody, or cheer somebody up when they're still at that first stage. That process doesn't start then. It starts with the tearing of the garment at the funeral, but then starts to take on a direction and a form with shiva. There was the Goldbergs were desperate to watch Hamilton on Broadway, but you know that this is interesting that today's saddest class is throwing in too many jokes, but I guess it's whatever. It's the circle of life, guys. So the Goldbergs really wanted to watch Hamilton, but have any of you been able to get a ticket to Hamilton? Maybe now in the pandemic when Broadway's closed, but when it was all the rage, you couldn't get tickets to Hamilton. Anyway, they went, they looked again, they went, they're on waiting list. They managed to get tickets to Hamilton, and they show up, come to Broadway, come to the theater, they come in, they sit down, they take their seats, and the theater is jam-packed. It's jammed. There's not an empty seat in the house, except for, of course, one seat right in front of them. The seat directly in front of Mrs. Goldberg is open. And of course, she can't focus now on the show because she's got to figure out how is there an open seat. Nobody could get tickets. And so she's trying to watch the show, but she can't because all she's thinking about is that empty seat. Who was the yokel that bought a seat that didn't get, what's going, she has to know the story. So finally she can't get there. So she taps the woman sitting in front of her husband on the shoulder and says, excuse me, ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an empty seat next to you. What happened? I know these tickets are impossible. You can't get tickets to the show. Like, there's an empty seat. What's going on? So the woman says, I'm sorry, it was my husband's seat. We bought 2 tickets to see the show together, but he passed away. So she says, oh, I'm sorry. My condolences. And she goes back to watching the show. She's watching the show. There's another song, another dance, another number. But you know how hard it is to get tickets to see Hamilton? And there's an empty seat. So she can't get there. She taps the woman on the shoulder and she says, I understand. You don't have any relatives or friends that you could have brought along with you? So the woman says, I do, but they're all at the shiva. Okay. Hope you guys still tune in next week. Everybody calm down. Okay. So at the shiva, there is there's a tradition, and we're going to get into a little bit more some shiva etiquette, like not telling that joke, for instance, at a shiva. But I mean, you could try at your own risk, but there's a saying that Ashkenazis have when they go to a shiva, which I guess is convenient because sometimes people walk into a shiva, you know that look when they walk into the house and looking all solemn and sorrowful, and they don't really know what to say or what to do. And it's hard to really talk. So the fact that we have a pre-scripted text that we can just echo, that's perfect. It gives us what to say. So let's look at text 9a, the consolation script, okay? This is what we say to mourners when they're sitting shiva. May the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. That's the statement that we make. So if there's one thing that you're going to say, the tradition is this is the statement you're going to make. What do you think is great about the statement, or what do you think is weird about the statement? So first of all, we say, well, the word here, the translation is "May the omnipresent God," but really in the original, what? Yeah, in the original, it doesn't say God; it just says the omnipresent one, Hamakom, the omnipresent one, which obviously is God. He's the omnipresent one. But we invoke him. So first of all, we're invoking God because really only God has the ability to comfort and console. As I mentioned, mourning, grief, loss, those are feelings that don't ever fully heal. Those are wounds that one doesn't really recover from. They say that time heals, but time really doesn't heal. It's God who heals through time, perhaps. It's one of the methods that God uses to heal. That the pain and the intensity of the pain is something that lessens over time. That's something that God instilled in human nature, right? That's something that God gave us, and God has other ways of helping people heal. So we invoke God because really only God can offer comfort. And interestingly, we refer to him not as God, but as the omnipresent one. And one of the reasons for that is because the word for omnipresent in the Hebrew, well, even the meaning in English, but in English means omnipresent means he's everywhere, right? He fills all the space, right? The word in Hebrew is hamakom, the space, like literally the space, right? Which tells us the sensitivity, the awareness that when a person is suffering a loss, there's a huge void now in their life. There's a huge hole in their heart, in their life, and a void is an uncomfortable space. It's unpleasant. It's not comfortable. It's unnatural. And so we say God, but we invoke God as the omnipresent one, or hamakom, the space, the one who fills that space. That it's God who has the capacity to comfort and console, and it's God who can fill that. Only God can fill that space. Nothing else, nobody else. So that's a certain sensitivity. Okay, but let's but here's another interesting thing we say there. And I mean, the truth is we can talk more and more about this statement itself. In general, we're going to just focus on one more point here. And that is, we say among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Where did the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem come from here? Right, so we know misery loves company. So we say a person's feeling sad. So it's nice to know there are other people. But first of all, who are these mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? What are we talking about? Why are we invoking the mourning for Zion and for Jerusalem? So let's take a look at text 9b, which is an excerpt from a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. We've been quoting him a lot in this course. And this is a letter that he wrote to Ariel Sharon. You may have heard of him. Ariel Sharon was a military hero in Israel, starting all the way back in the War of Independence. And during the Six-Day War, he was a commander of a unit in the Sinai Desert and led a very impressive campaign there. And of course, we know that in the Six-Day War, Israel experienced a resounding, miraculous victory over its enemies. And all of Israel, and really all of world Jewry, was so moved and inspired by that great victory. It was like it restored Jewish pride that for the first time since the Holocaust, more so even than founding the state, any of that. It was something that Jews felt a certain pride really across the globe, across all political affiliations and lines. It was something that was really unprecedented and probably unrivaled since then as well. So think about this. It's the Six-Day War is over. Everybody all of world Jewry is on a high. Israel, certainly they're on a high. Their military commanders and are victorious, are heroes. And 4 months after the Six-Day War, Ariel Sharon's 11-year-old son is playing with a friend at the family estate, and they're playing with a rifle, and his son is shot and killed. An accident. And the Rebbe at that time sends an unsolicited, really, letter to Ariel Sharon to offer words of comfort and consolation. So this is an excerpt from that letter. Let's take a look here at text 9b. In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, right? So the Rebbe actually touches on these points about this statement that we just read in 9a. And here, this section here of the letter focuses on what we just mentioned about Zion and Jerusalem. So this is like this. In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans, and before them the Babylonians, were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence, contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth. And so that's why we make that connection for the mourner and say, what has been lost? Only the wood and stone, the gold and the silver, but the spirit. I think about for thousands of years, right? The temple was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago. And for almost 2,000 years, Jews, whenever possible, have been flocking to the Western Wall. What's the Western Wall? It's the remaining wall, retaining wall of the temple, the outer wall. And in a way, it stands as a symbol of destruction. And yet, it's a spot that offers eternal optimism and hope to so many, because we know that we come so close to the Temple Mount, to that place where our prayers ascend to heaven. It's a spot, it's a location that has offered so much hope and comfort and yearning and longing in our people for millennia. That connection to that spot, that attachment to that place, even though there's a destruction that's so visible, yet the spirit of the space, the holiness of the place lives on and endures and has throughout the ages, across all geographical locations and societal cultures and so on, and that because it's eternal and enduring and everlasting. And the same is true with the human being, with our lives, with the soul, that it lasts and remains and endures. So we'll skip to text 10, which tells us sort of that we can reimagine this idea of the tearing of the garment also in this way, right? Which is, we've been talking about tearing our garments as a form of devastation, of shattered hopes and shattered perspective and shattered values. But you can also look at it another way, which is we tear a garment. It's a physical thing. It's the shell. It's the external. But the soul inside still remains. My garment is broken, but my spirit is not. Right? It's something that's external. The person's body is now gone, but their soul, that spirit lives on. Okay? Now, it's important, I think, to spend some time talking also about, well, it's very nice that we have all these stages and we have these perspectives, but in reality, people have a hard time dealing with loss and death, and some people end up sort of trapped or stuck in this grief, right? So there are many different ways a person can experience grief or manifest it. There's feelings of denial, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of loneliness, sadness. There are all kinds of feelings. But tonight, let's focus on two of them. I think the two that are worth spending a few minutes on talking about. And those two feelings that are totally natural. And as we mentioned right at the outset, there's no correct way to mourn and to grieve. Nobody can tell you how to do it or how not to do it. But the value we are putting forth here and presenting is that it's important to not be stuck in it. That Judaism encourages us and actually focuses us and walks us, leads us to a path of being able to move forward in life. But what happens if a person is stuck with certain feelings? Which feelings we're going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about anger and injustice. Feelings of anger, when a person is grieving and suffering loss, it's not uncommon for them in the throes of those terrible, intense feelings to feel angry. Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at the universe, angry. So how do we deal with feelings of anger? And also injustice. How do we deal with these feelings? Well, we're also going to talk about another one in a moment, but we'll focus on anger and injustice, and also we're going to talk about guilt. That will leave for a couple of minutes from now. So anger and injustice. Why does a person feel angry? Because they feel that it's not justified, that there was a senseless death. But to be able to put ourselves into that mind frame, why a person might feel angry, right? So say a person lives to 95 years old in good health, they're healthy till their last day of their life. The last day they die. What the cause of death? Life, old age. That's why they passed away. They were in good health. They had all their faculties, all their capabilities. They were functional, productive up until the last moment. They went to sleep at 95 years old, and they didn't wake up the next morning, pass away nicely in their sleep. You can imagine for their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, they'd be very sad. This person was here in this world for 95 years, was a big part of everybody's life, especially because they weren't even deteriorating. They were as vibrant as when they were younger. And so they were very active members of everybody's life. They weren't slowly fading away. They were present, and suddenly they're gone. Yet, it's not likely that when one grieves and is saddened by their death, that they will end up being angry, that they'll feel somehow that justice wasn't served. Why? Because the person lived a healthy life, a long life, a fruitful life. They lived a good life all the way till the end. There's nothing really to be angry about. But suppose a 19-year-old college student who suddenly contracts a deadly disease, the dreaded disease, and goes through a few months of intense chemo and radiation and all of that, and then ultimately, though, dies at the ripe old age of 19 with their whole life still ahead of them. Imagine the feeling of loss that a person might feel, and imagine how that grief could somehow lead to anger. Anger at the injustice of it. This is a young child. This is somebody who had a whole life ahead of them. So let's try, and obviously this is something that could be deeply personal to anybody here tonight. So forgive me for bringing it up, but let's try and work our way through these feelings. Now, again, obviously a person could also develop any of these types of feelings for any circumstance, but this is just a contrast that helps us appreciate it. What's the difference? Why is it that the 95-year-old man who passes away, we're sad, it's terrible, death sucks, all true, but there's no injustice. We're not angry at anyone for it. Whereas a young person, a teenager, a young mother with young children, that angers us. The reason is because we feel that shouldn't have happened, right? So let's learn something interesting, very interesting text here, text 11. Okay, text 11 is a text about one of the great Jewish sages, an individual who actually is almost singularly, well, we say that about a few, so they're not, I guess it's not singularly, but one of a handful of sages that are credited with being the architects and really the critical figures that took Judaism from temple-centric and temple-based religion and culture and faith in the temple and really turned it into a religion that's practiced to this day, that flourished in exile outside of the temple. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that's his name, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived during the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem in the Second Temple. Right, there's the famous story in the Talmud about his encounter with Vespasian, when Vespasian found out that he found out during the siege that he was that the emperor had died, and he was now the new emperor, and he was heading back to Rome. So his son finished the job in destroying the temple, his son Titus. But Rabbi Yochanan was there and meets with him. And anyway, but that's not for now. But the point is, he's a very important figure. Coincidentally, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, if I'm not mistaken, lived to be 120. Passed away, I think, in 120. Lived a full life. Anyway, let's read about what happened with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai when one of his children passed away. Okay, text 11. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, right, so this is something that happens almost 2,000 years ago, this story, yeah? His students arrived to console him. Rabbi Eliezer entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he accepted consolation? For it is stated, Adam was again intimate with his wife. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. This is what his great student Rabbi Eliezer said. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Adam as well? Rabbi Yeshua entered and asked, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yeshua said, Job had sons and daughters, and they all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should also accept consolation. How do we know that Job was consoled? For he declared, God has given and God has taken. May God's name be blessed. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pained for Job as well? Rabbi Yossi entered. Anyway, this continues. He talks about Aaron, and then he continue the same reaction. King David, and then finally, let's fast forward a couple of paragraphs. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he talked. So, and the same story repeats itself. Another student says, Aaron was consoled, so you should be consoled. And he brings scriptural proof of it. Another one says, David was consoled at the death of his son. And again, in all these instances, Rabbi Yochanan says, not only am I feeling bad about my loss, you're also making me feel bad about their loss. It's not working, obviously. Finally, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person, and I will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. Right, so we mentioned about bathing and showering during shiva, during shloshim. It's a sign of mourning. One doesn't. Certainly back then, when you had to go to the bathhouse, it was all production. He was still in his mourning clothing, and he was probably in need of a shower, but was refusing to get up. And when he saw Rabbi Elazar ben Arach come, he's like, "Okay, let's go. Let's get ready to go because this is going to be good." Okay, what happened? Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and told him, "Let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear. Woe is to me! When will I emerge unharmed from this safekeeping row? You, master, also had a son. He was fluent in Torah, the prophets, scriptures, in the Mishnah, the Halacha, Jewish law, in the exegetical sense. I'm having a hard time with that word now. Teachings, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition." Rabbi Yochanan responded, "Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion." So what was it about Rabbi Elazar's words to Rabbi Yochanan that got to him? First of all, as we've been mentioning tonight, everybody mourns differently. Everybody processes loss differently. So when his other students are telling him about people that were consoled, what's that have to do with him? Great, this one was consoled. What's that have to do with me? I'm different. I'm my own person. I'm my own way. So the fact that somebody else was comforted and was able to find consolation has no bearing on me, right? Number one. Number two, if you're quoting Adam, you're citing Adam and you're citing King David, talking about the greats. Who am I? They maybe were of such great moral stature and strength and character, they were able to do it. But me, I don't know that I can still do the same thing. And furthermore, you can't tell somebody because people are consoled, you should also. The heart doesn't respond to commands, right? The heart does what it does and feels what it feels. You can't command somebody to do something. And, okay, now I feel differently. I command you not to like pizza. Okay, you convinced me I don't like pizza anymore. Can't do it. What was unique about Rabbi Elazar ben Arach's message was that it was, first of all, personal and tailored specifically to Rabbi Yochanan, right? It wasn't about anybody else. It wasn't like being like anybody else. And Rabbi Elazar, so he tailors it for him and he gives him 2 points. Number one, he says, what does he say in the parable? That a person gets something for safekeeping, and it's so precious, it's so important, it's so valuable that you're nervous because you're liable for it, right? So imagine somebody comes to you and says, "Here, this is my family heirloom. It's been in my family for 1,000 years. It actually is priceless. Here, why don't you keep an eye on it for a week while I go skiing?" How are you going to feel? You're going to be a wreck until they come home. What if something happens? What if it drops? What if it breaks? What if it's stolen? You'd be nervous. And when they come back, you'd be relieved, right? So there's a deposit that you're given. Says Rabbi Lazar, life is a deposit. We talked about this last week, if you recall, when we talked a little bit about cremation, that life is not our own. We didn't birth ourselves. We didn't choose to be born, right? It's God who grants us this deposit of life. And so now, how long does that last for? The deposit is dictated, the terms of that are dictated by the one who gives it to you, right? So for instance, going back to the analogy we had before, a 95-year-old man dies, and we say, yeah, that's fine. There's nothing to be upset about. Why? Because we know what's an average lifespan. Well, the Torah says 120 years, right? We know lifespan, 70, 80, 90 years. That's a lifespan. But imagine if life expectancy today was 240 years. Then when a 95-year-old passes away, you'd also be pretty outraged. That shouldn't have happened. You should have lived to 240, right? So it's all a matter of the context and what we're comparing it to. But if life is a deposit from God, and it's God who sets those terms, so then you can't compare one life to another. You can't compare one to another, right? And so therefore, God gives us life, gives us a deposit, and there's a specific reason that he gives it to us. And that reason is expressed in that lifespan that he gives, that he allots for it. And those are those terms. So there's nothing to compare to. It's not a matter of comparing one life to another, one lifetime to another. Another point he makes is he says that your son was a really special person, right? He was fluent in all of these things. And in Torah and in halacha and so on and so forth. So clearly this is somebody who's a very, very special person, which tells us what? That this is a person who lived a fulfilled life, who lived a good life, a moral life, and a life that was full of purpose, right? So there's nothing to mourn here. And again, we're talking about loss, but the point is that ultimately, think about it this way. People come to a shiva house, or somebody tells somebody that they lost somebody, right? What's the natural reaction when you talk about these people, right? When you reflect about them, you talk about how wonderful they were, how special they were, right? So think of it. Think about the absurdity of it. Person's grieving, they're sitting shiva, right? And they're mourning the loss of whoever, right? Somebody's mourning the loss, maybe for the context of our conversation, of a child. God forbid, nobody should ever know from such a thing. Somebody's sitting and grieving the loss of a child. And somebody comes to the house, a friend, a neighbor, a well-intentioned individual comes and says, "Oh, your son was an angel. Your daughter was the kindest, the nicest, had a smile that lit up a room, brought joy to everyone." Why would you say something like that? Shouldn't that make the person feel even worse? It was such a good person that I lost, right? The better they were, the greater the loss. Really what you should do is come in and say, "Oh, your son was a loser, a lowlife. He was going to amount to nothing." That would make more sense, right? You're grieving the loss of somebody, you come to the house. The appropriate thing should be to say, no great loss. You're better off without him in your life. He was going to amount to nothing. He was just going to milk you dry. He was going to rob you and steal from you and cheat you, and he was going to throw you in a home the first second he had and forget about you. That's what you should say. No, then feel better. No, that's not how it works. Why not? Do you understand what I'm saying? How interesting that is? No, we talk about how good the person was. Why? Why is that comforting? Because it tells us that the person's life was a life that was fulfilled. So if life is a deposit from God, and we're put here in the world with a purpose. How long that purpose is supposed to be carried out? Yeah, for most people, maybe it's 120 years. Some people, maybe their purpose is so special, maybe they're so special that they can do what it takes a regular person to do in 120 years, they can do it in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And so when we reflect on that, and reflect on their goodness and their character and so on, that offers comfort. That's comforting, because it refocuses our attention on the fact that we don't own life, and so therefore we don't set the terms for life. That allows us, hopefully, to get past, or to start healing from those feelings of anger and that sense of injustice, when we can focus on those two elements. Okay. But then there's another feeling that could creep up and creep in, and that is a feeling of guilt. Like there's survivor's guilt, right? People feel that we're not going to talk about that. That's a different kind of a psychological situation. And by the way, I just want to mention that now we talked about anger and we're talking about guilt. Like when people, if somebody who's feeling intense, or acute grief, could use probably some professional help as well. We're talking here what the Torah values are, the perspectives, things that can guide us, help us deal with the inevitable, as well as maybe ways that we can approach offering assistance to a friend or a loved one. But at the same time, sometimes people need some serious professional intervention. Maybe people might need medication or other kinds of therapies, so on. So we have to be able to recognize that as well, be sensitive to that. But let's, having said that little disclaimer, let's talk about guilt a second. A person passes away, and right away you feel, I didn't say I love you enough. The last time we spoke, we got into a fight, and I let it fester, and I never apologized. You feel guilty, right? Or you name, fill in the blank of any of those feelings. Why a person could feel guilty? Why does one feel guilty? Because it's too late. That's where the feeling of guilt comes from. I had an opportunity to say I love you, now it's too late. I had an opportunity to ask for forgiveness or to try and repair our relationship, it's too late. Right? I had an opportunity to help them out, didn't help them, too late. And so we feel guilty. So what we've already studied last week should help us know what the answer to this would be. And let's take a look at an interesting, interesting little anecdote here. Text 12. When children say Kaddish for their parents, text 12, page 108. When children say Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah on their behalf, it is like sending them a letter. And when they fulfill mitzvahs and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it is like sending them an entire parcel, sending them a little Amazon Prime package. So what is this telling us? What we have already studied last week, we know life, and the week before, life doesn't end with death. Life continues. The soul continues to live on. And as we talked about last week, the relationship that we have with people that passed away continues even after they passed away. So it's never too late. There's a custom that we have that when a person passes away, so during the funeral, the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society, the Burial Society, do this during the Torah. At different times, they're constantly asking forgiveness from the deceased because they want to make sure that they're handling them with the utmost care. We talked a lot about that last week, about the way the reverence and respect and honor with which we handle a corpse, a body. And so they're constantly asking forgiveness in case they do something that's maybe inappropriate, in case they do something that's not the right thing. So they're constantly asking for forgiveness. But there's a tradition of people who knew the one who passed away at the funeral, they would go and they would ask forgiveness. You approach the body, approach the coffin, and ask the person for forgiveness, because it's not too late to be forgiven. And you'd like to allow that person to go up to heaven without having any outstanding grievances, right? Without any of those things. So that's something that we do. If you miss the funeral, it's not too late. We can always go to their burial place and ask forgiveness there. And certainly last week we talked about the relationship that remains and the way and the significance of going to a person's grave where the nefesh still resides and there's a sort of a portal, a direct connection to the person. But from this text 12, we see that we're really broadening it. We're expanding that to even beyond that. You don't just have to go to the funeral. You don't have to just go to the grave. But anything that you do in that person's honor, that person's memory, that's something that is a tribute and a benefit to the person even in heaven. Right? So, we're going to tell a joke, but it's okay. No, I'll tell it, right? So the three old Jewish women are sitting together and they're talking, and one says, "Oh, my son is just the best. He's the best. He is a big doctor, and he's the head of a department in a hospital, and he's making a good living. And every week he sends me flowers. Oh, just such nachas. What an angel." The next one says, "Hey, your son. My son is the top partner in his law firm. which is the biggest law firm in the whole country. And he's making so much money that he said, doesn't just send me flowers, he bought me a big house that I live in, he bought me a car, he's constantly sending me stuff, he's sending me cruise tickets to go on cruises, he's constantly sending me all the stuff, he's spending so much money on me. I'm so proud of him. And the third mother says, that's nothing. My son pays somebody $150 an hour to talk once a week, and all he wants to do is talk about me. Okay, I kind of butchered that one? No, okay. So that's nachas. The point is that that relationship continues. I'm not sure how it relates, but it connects somehow to what we're talking about, okay? It connects. I'm distracted by the email that I was sending before the class, so it's, so everything's going sideways. Now, that relationship, that connection, it continues. We think about them, but not just think about them, we do things for them. We do things for those that have passed, and those are merits for them, and sending them messages, packages, and benefits even up in heaven. Okay, so let's wrap it up tonight with some practical some practical shiva etiquette. Okay, so supposed to we mentioned that there's a mitzvah to grieve, but there's also, we have an obligation. Text 13. Look at text 13. Yeah, you're with me on page 111. Maimonides says, the sages are obligated us to visit the sick and console mourners. These are deeds of kindness that one carries out in person and have no limit. Although these are rabbinic ordinances, they fall under the purview of the biblical commandment to love your fellow as yourself. So we kind of started our class talking about the biblical commandment to mourn, right? That the next of kin has a biblical requirement to mourn. Here, Maimonides is telling us that there's a rabbinic commandment that's actually debated among the halachic authorities as to whether it's a biblical or rabbinic commandment. Either way, we have a responsibility, a requirement, an obligation to comfort the mourners. So mourners have an obligation to mourn, and everybody else has an obligation to console them, to comfort them. That's an obligation we have. And even if the specifics of comforting a mourner are maybe rabbinic in law, but they still fall under the rubric of the mitzvah of to love your fellow as yourself, which is certainly a biblical command. It's a verse in the Torah. Love your fellow as yourself in Leviticus, right? So it's certainly a part of that at the very least. Okay, so we have an obligation to comfort mourners, which means that we have to reach out to people when they're sitting shiva. Sometimes it's uncomfortable for people. Do you call them on the phone? Do you go visit them? Do you Zoom with them? Do you send them a letter? The answer is you do all of the above. Do all of the above. The more you can do, the better. But let's take a look quickly at a list of the basic shiva protocol here, figure 3.5 on page 110. Let's just jump back a second here. Okay. So number one, what goes on, what to expect in a shiva house with a mourner, somebody who's in mourning, somebody who's observing shiva. So the mirrors and pictures in the shiva house are to remain covered. That's a very interesting custom, and it's got some very funky and interesting reasons for it. But a very simple, basic one would be that, not such a funky one, would be that the mirror is really, the purpose of it is really vanity, right? To how we look and a focus on our physical outward appearance. But as we've said, everything about mourning and grief is that outer shell has been broken, and comfort is going to come from within, from the enduring internal. Outer beauty fades. It goes away. The inner beauty lasts, not only lasts, it gets more, it ages well. It grows and deepens over time. So that's a reason why we cover the mirrors and pictures. And then for the duration of Shiva, the mourners observe the following conditions. They remain in the house of mourning. I remember last week we actually talked about sitting Shiva, if possible, in the home of the person who had passed away, right? Because their soul goes back and forth from the grave back to the house of recall. So sitting in the house of mourning. Continue wearing the garment that was torn as an act of mourning. So the garment that they tore, that they wear that the whole week. Sit on low chairs or stools. So they sit lower than everybody else. Forgo the comfort of leather footwear. They don't wear leather shoes. Avoid listening to music. Shun shaving and haircuts. Abstain from work or business. So one who's observing Shiva actually shuts their business for the week. There's actually a practice that when somebody's sitting Shiva, if they're the sole proprietor, they're the only owners of their business, and it's a business that they can't really afford to close, so they actually sort of sell their business for the week to somebody else. Somebody else runs it, but they draft a contract that transfers the ownership of the business to somebody else. Eventually, after the Shiva, the person can sell it back to them, right? Or they can buy it back or whatever, but there's this, it transfers back. But like this, they're not operating their business during that week. Refrain from marital intimacy. Avoid studying Torah. That's an interesting one. The only thing that a mourner would be allowed to study during the week of mourning is the laws that pertain to mourning, because most people, thankfully, until they have to deal with it and live through it, are not so familiar with them. So that they're allowed to study. But other Torah study, they're not allowed to study. It says, that the words of Torah gladden the heart. And as we've said, the Torah, Judaism, respects the grieving process, respects the dignity of the mourner who's sad, and is not trying to jumpstart this getting over it and bringing them extra joy, giving them space, respecting that space of grief, and so therefore they're not allowed to study Torah, because Torah brings joy. There are restrictions on bathing, showering, and wearing freshly laundered clothing. A minyan gathers in the house of mourning for the daily prayers. During the prayer services, the mourners recite the Kaddish. Relatives, friends, and community members visit the mourners at their shiva house to fulfill the mitzvah of consoling the mourner and to participate in prayers, Torah study, and giving charity in the merit of the departed. So a common sight you'll see in a house of a mourner would be some charity boxes, because it's a good thing for people that are visiting also to give to charity at that time. Charity being, in a way, the most physical of acts of mitzvahs. It's literally giving somebody physical life. So charity is always, it's held up always as the mitzvah, right? And it's also the perfect tie-in. That's why we talk about charity. If you've ever said Yiskar, so you notice, and Yiskar is tied to a pledge to charity, right? We make a pledge to charity during Yiskar. That's really probably the best way to commemorate somebody. Okay, now. So those are some of the things you're going to find in a shiva house. Now, what's interesting is that obviously, as we've been saying, everybody mourns differently. You come to a shiva house, you don't know how the person that's grieving is going to grieve, and if there are a number of people in the house, they might all be grieving in very different ways, right? Some might seem to be a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit calmer. Some might be stoic. Some might be just beside themselves, a total basket cases. You don't really know how the person is processing their loss. So there's actually a law that when you come to a shiva house, you're not supposed to initiate conversation. The mourner is supposed to start the conversation. Now, if a group of people are there, it's enough for the mourner to just throw something out in general, and that gets the conversation going. Then you can jump in. But as a general rule, you don't speak until spoken to. Because, again, you're coming here to be there for them. To come there, guns blazing, I'm here to entertain you, I'm here to distract you, I'm here to mourn, here to grieve it. No. That throws off those dynamics, and it's very easy to transition from coming to be there for the person mourning to I'm going to now share, do, and perform whatever way. No, we come there with respect for the other person, allow them that space, and let them initiate that conversation, and let them lead it to where it's going to go. So let's look at text 14, a very interesting text from the Talmud. The reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence. So we say it's a mitzvah to visit the home of a mourner, and you get reward for what? Not for what you say, but for what you don't say, for being quiet. Which is why it says the next another quote from Talmud, text 15: the comforters may not say anything until the mourner opens that conversation. Okay, so that's some basic principles. If we remember that when we come to the home of mourning, and we're respectful, and the mourner initiates that conversation, that gives us some guardrail to make sure that we don't overstep our boundaries. We don't say something stupid. We don't say something insensitive. We don't make it about ourselves. We don't try to out-mourn the mourners or show them that we're just as beside ourselves as they are, just as devastated as they are. Let's not try to outdo what they're doing or outdo what they're feeling, right? So I'm assuming that really we can go through a list of things to say and things not to say, but I think as a general rule, the guidelines that we have already discussed tonight is enough that if you have a little bit of sensitivity and a little bit of seichel, right, you'll be able to be really of comfort, and to remember that really the ultimate comfort is going to be just from your presence, just from being there, just from saying, hey, and not by saying this verbally, but just by actually showing up. It's that presence that says, I care, I'm here, and that itself is already comforting. Okay, when we're going to talk though at the mourner's house, because eventually the conversation is going to happen. Yeah. So what should we talk about? Now, remember, we said that the first 3 days is for weeping. That's a time there's very little comforting that's really taking place. And the last 4 days is for eulogy, right? For eulogizing, which means what? It means to talk about the person, the deceased, talk about their qualities, talk about their life, share stories, share memories. And that is something that naturally, it seems like we naturally gravitate to, right? When paying a shiva call. But let's see text 16 from the Midrash. And we're gonna finish with this tonight, okay? Text 16 on page 112. The final word regarding a person is that of the people. The final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds, commenting, so and so was upright, so and so was God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, "See what people are saying about him." If they say that he had been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise. So we come to a shiva house and we share good things, good memories, nice things. We have nice things to say. Then that benefits them as well. Not only, again, so we're flipping back and forth here, not only does it offer comfort to those left behind, the ones mourning and grieving, but it's actually a benefit as well to the one who's departed. And that's like the funeral where there's a rabbi, the rabbi was out of town and a member of his community had passed away. So they called the rabbi the next time over to come perform the funeral. So the rabbi comes. What's he going to say? He can't really eulogize the guy because he know him, but he's at the funeral and he wants to say something. So he looks for something generic, and so he says, after he does the Kel Maleh and he did the whole thing, and he says some verses of Psalms. Then he says, the departed was an upstanding member of the community, a pillar of support to the community. And in the back, some guy gets, "What are you talking about? Yankel, he didn't give a dime. He didn't participate in the Purim project. He didn't participate in the building campaign. He didn't participate in any of that. He was not a contributing member." Okay, so the rabbi says, "Okay, well, at least he was an honest individual who conducted his business properly and morally." The guy in the back screams, "What are you talking about, Rabbi? This guy, he would sell his own mother. He's not honest, man. He didn't have an honest bone in his body." What's he supposed to do? The rabbi says, "Well, Mr. Goldberg was a big scholar who certainly learned and was very knowledgeable in Jewish law, Jewish tradition. The guy didn't know what way to hold the prayer book. He didn't know how to open it. What are you talking about?" So the rabbi is already schwitzing and he's exasperated. So he finally says, "Do you have anything nice to say about this man?" And it's quiet. And finally the guy says, "His brother was much worse." Okay. The point is, there's always something nice to say about somebody. There's always something nice to say. And we're going to finish on that note. Thank you all for joining. Next week, we're going to talk about heaven and hell. That should be delightful. And until then,